Okay, let's look at the second slideshow presentation. This one is in a PDF form. And so we can just save this one. I'm going to save it as a document to my desktop so that I can just go through it with you there. We're going to close this now. Alright, so in the first PowerPoint that you saw, we looked at, the one that was actually a PPT, PowerPoint file, we saw that it was about evaluating sources and whether they're reliable or not. And in there we talked about whether sources existed before the internet, prior to the internet, and we said that most sources that existed before the internet are reliable. And so this short slideshow is just a review of what sources existed before the internet. So if you want to know if it's reliable and you ask that question, did it exist before the internet, you know which ones did. So let's look at some of these sources. I'm saying BI is before the internet. So news and information source. These are the types of sources that existed before the internet. The media is made up of all kinds of things. All of this plus, film and television and music and all of that is part of the media. But we're looking at information media, not entertainment media. So we're not going to talk about music and we're not going to talk about movies and TV shows because that's entertainment. And we're not talking about advertisements either. We're talking about news and information sources. So if it existed before the internet, it is probably a trustworthy source of information. So what news media existed before the internet, which really started taking off in the late 1990s? So these are the types: newspapers and wires, magazines, TV and radio news, business brochures, encyclopedias, government and legal documents, and books. So let's look at the first one, newspapers. So some of these you may have heard of. There's a lot more than just these few. But these are the big ones. These are the major ones. These are the ones you can absolutely trust. The New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Wall Street Journal, which Wall Street is the main business street in New York, where all of the really big financial dealings happen. The USA Today, Washington Post. Washington Post is from Washington, D.C., not the state of Washington. Now notice that most of these are linked to a specific city. Most newspapers are city originating from specific places. Now, the USA Today is the only newspaper that is not. And USA Today refers to itself as the nation's newspaper. It doesn't have a local section in the paper. There's no local news because it doesn't support one specific city. It is a national newspaper. When you travel and you go to hotels, often hotels will give you complimentary copies of USA Today because they know it doesn't matter from where you're from, that the news is going to be relevant to you because it's not local news. Newspapers are centuries old and have been the most respected form of media, except for maybe some books, throughout time. And if you follow this link here, American Newspapers by Circulation, it takes you to a list of a lot of the newspapers, a longer list than this short little one. Now, most newspapers are either daily or weekly. Sometimes they're semi-weekly, which means couple times a week, but most of them are daily, like these big ones: New York Times, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, Washington Post. They're all going to be daily. USA Today is actually daily, Monday through Friday, but it's not published on weekends. So they're big organizations, and they have a lot of money and a lot of authority. They're really respectable. Now, the wire services support the newspapers and also television news. They've been around for a long time. A wire service is an organization. The Associated Press is the biggest one, AP. They gather news. They send out their own reporters, just like newspapers, and they then they share their news. They don't necessarily publish the news themselves or distribute the news. They share it or sell it to other news organizations, because news organizations like the LA Times, they can't be all over the world. They just can't. So they try to, and they have reporters all over the world, but they rely on other organizations sharing news with them, and that's why these news services, these wire services exist, because they get news and they share it with all the newspapers. So you might find a story that the Associated Press wrote, and you'll find that story in the Chicago Tribune, in the LA Times, and the New York Times. They'll all have the same story. It'll be word for word, almost identical. And that's because it is the same story. It was written by the one person who shared that story with all three newspapers. So that's why it is exactly the same story. So if you're asking who is the author of this story, where did this story come from, it's not the LA Times. It's not the New York Times. It is the Associated Press. So in assignments, when you're turning them in class, and if the part of the assignment is, who is the source? Where did you get this story? And you found the story in the LA Times, but it says Associated Press by it. The LA Times is not the source for the story. The Associated Press is the source for the story. So keep that in mind. And the story will say, at the very beginning somewhere, it will either have an AP in front of it, or it will say from the Associated Press, or any of these others, Dow Jones, Newswires, Reuters, or UPI, United Press International. But AP is the biggest one. And you'll see those. It doesn't take much to find AP stories in the LA Times. And they're called wire services because they used to be referred to as off the wire. The wire was one of the first technologies. It's been, even before the phone, before the internet, even before the phone, it's that old. The wires, used to do Morse code over the wires. So, digital news created since the internet. Now, these are newspapers that are online that have been created since the internet. And I know this slideshow is about things that existed before the internet, but it's important to note that there are some papers and some news sources that have developed since the internet. And they are big newspapers and big sources and as reliable as the other ones that existed before the internet. And so it's important to note that who they are. The Huffington Post is one. It is a huge newspaper. It owns AOL, America Online. And so it is the source for the AOL news. Then Google, Yahoo, MSN, these are all new. Sometimes they have news feeds. They get their sources from The Wire. They get their sources from other news sources. Or they might even have their own original news sources that they are, as they expand and grow and become bigger organizations, they might even be coming with their own. But I know MSN is owned by NBC News, so they're going to get their sources from NBC. Now, Google and Yahoo, I don't know where they get their news from, but they're going to be reliable, responsible organizations. They're big and they're trustworthy. So keep that in mind. Those are reliable sources. Now, magazines. Magazines have also been around a long time before the internet, and there are some very important ones that are reliable. Magazines are weekly, monthly, or quarterly. The most reliable ones are the news magazines that are weekly, like Time and Newsweek, the U.S. News and World Report. These are very highly respected and highly reliable magazines. Entertainment Weekly is also, it's owned by the same company that owns Time. Time owns several magazines, Fortune, Money, Life. It owns a lot of magazines. Entertainment Weekly is, even though it's entertainment, it's news about the entertainment industry. So if your story is about the movie business or the music business, then Entertainment Weekly is going to be a reliable source on that topic. Entertainment Weekly is not meant to entertain you. It's meant to tell you about the entertainment industry. And there's a link here for a lot of top magazines. if you want to look at a longer list. So now we are looking at TV and radio news. There's a lot of local radio news and a local TV news like KNBC and KABC. These are local channels in LA. And there's local radio stations in LA. But the national radio and television news are also been around for a long time, very highly respected. 60 Minutes is part of the CBS News. ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, these are big news organizations, have been around. Big TV channels existed long before cable television list existed. So at least the first three. Fox is a little newer. And so Dateline NBC is on NBC, 60 Minutes is on CBS, and there's one on ABC. What is it called? I forget what it's called. 2020. That's the ABC one. And then CNN also is a big, reliable news source, obviously. PBS, MSNBC. And then as far as radio goes, they're the biggest and most well-known and most well-respected news source on nationally is NPR, which is the National Public Radio, which I love and listen to every day on the way to work. It's the best news. It's commercial-free and one of the most respected and sources of news you will come by. If you love being informed, loved interesting news, NPR, and they make it interesting. It's sometimes you're the things I'm like, I'm not interested in this, and I'll listen to NPR and I'm like, wow, that was kind of interesting. And there's a source here for broadcast news too if you want to look up some more other sources. Whoops, this is moving quickly. Business brochures. So before the internet, if a business wanted to promote itself, it would create and print a brochure, a little flyer. You fold it three ways and tell you about the business and tell you all kinds of information that you need to know, that they want you to know to help them do their business. But now they have websites. And some of them still have brochures, but websites is the big way of them putting their information out. Now, are businesses trustworthy? Sometimes. Businesses want to sell you things, but also they want you to have accurate information about their business. If you're doing a story on the fashion industry and you want to know information about the fashion business, the fashion businesses are going to give you reliable information about their business because they want to be respected as serious businesses. So they're not going to give you false information. And so, unless it's an advertisement. And even advertisements tend to be true, but they're geared toward trying to sell you something. They have a little more emotion in them, and they have a little bit more direction into a specific thing that they want you to think about. But so you can, as you learn and grow, you'll be able to distinguish between when the business is trying to sell you something and when they're just trying to give you information. Encyclopedias, these are not as popular anymore because of the internet. They came in volumes and they were updated every year. Many libraries still have them. Wikipedia is kind of the new thing that's replaced them, but again, Wikipedia can be updated by anyone. But encyclopedias are just books on everything. I mean, they used to be the knowledge base of where you would go to find stuff. When I was a kid, that's where we went and did our research. Go look in the encyclopedia. What does it say? Now we go Google it. Go look on the internet. So obviously the internet has really destroyed the encyclopedia business. They still exist, but they're not as big as they used to be. Not nearly at all. And government and legal documents. Now these are sources of information that you're taking directly to the source. So if there's legislation in Congress, they have to document it. Lawsuits, if you want to know about any kind of legal contract, legal action that happened, you can go look up the copies of the legal documents in the court records. Because these things happen every day. If there's a medical lawsuit, there are records of them that you can find. So if you're reporting on some epidemic, now you can go to the hospitals and get their legal documents. Now a lot of it's confidential, but there'll be documents that the hospitals will give out as well. So it's not limited to just courts and government agencies. Hospitals, especially if they're government funded hospitals or medical institutions, they will also can provide information. But these have existed long before the internet. These are the original sources that people talk about on the internet. But you can go and find them firsthand and find them for yourself if you actually go to the courtroom, go to the legal library, go to the government library, go to the court of records or the county records office and look things up, and you will see them there. So, but you have to request them, and most of them are available to the public because it's the law that they need to be available to the public, but you have to go through a formal way of requesting them. And sorry about that, was my phone. And last but not least are books. Books are the oldest form of media. Obviously, that's somebody got a book wrote. They did a lot of research. Most publishers are not going to publish books that don't have reliable information, though there are some propaganda books out there that people have written that they have an agenda, political agenda, religious agenda that they want to get out there, and they found a publisher that would publish their book. Most major big publishers are not going to publish them, so it's about knowing who the publishers are, knowing who the big name publishers are. If it's a small name publisher and it's a political or religious book, then you have to learn to distinguish between it, whether it's reliable or not. Again, consider the source, consider who's saying it and what their motive is. So today with the internet, also known as the World Wide Web, so I'm saying WI for with the internet as opposed to BI before the internet. Everything prior is now online, so all of these old sources are now online, but in a different way and easier. Like you can scroll through a newspaper much easier. You can find things because you can just put in a search and go straight to it rather than have to flip through the pages. But there's also new forms of media. Google Images, podcasts, social media, which is huge, blogs, file sharing. So there's all kinds of new media. And that's where it gets complicated, and we're trying to figure out and navigate this new media world and what is reliable and what is not reliable and what is the purpose and what is the motive and why is it there. And it's still a little bit in development. It hasn't been, it's been less than 20 years that some of this stuff has been around. So it's not tried and true. So do you think it's easier now with the internet or before the internet? Yes, it's a lot easier to find things and you don't have to go somewhere. You could just log on. But so many sources, it's hard to keep up. And there's so many unreliable sources. As many unreliable sources as there are reliable. So you have to put your brain at work and try to figure out whether they're reliable or not. And it's time consuming because there is so much information. And it's more expensive. Look at your phone bills. If you're on the internet all the time, look at your phone bills and your DSL bills and your internet bills. So we're paying for it directly, where you used to be able to just go to the library. Well, you paid for it with your gas, I guess, when you had to drive there. But it is more expensive now. People's phone bills are... When I was a kid, your phone bill was $5. Now it can be $500, depending on how much you use your phone. So, yeah, it's more expensive. Unhealthy. The internet has brought with it a lot of negatives. We sit too much in front of the screen. It's not healthy for us. We're not out physically getting exercise. A lot of the media on the internet is violent and exploitive. You have porn, you have blood and guts, and some of it is just disgusting and evil and just unethical. And you have to be aware of that. It's there, and you got to be careful not to go to see it, and be careful not to take it seriously, and or to not get caught up in it. It's just bad. So you have to. There's a lot of bad people out there putting bad stuff on the internet, and you have to be very careful about that. And as when you're a parent, you really worry about what your children are seeing. So that's the downside. And criminals share secrets now. Used to be, how do you make a bomb? Well, now you can just go online and find that information. So criminals, whole criminal networks use the internet to plot their crimes. So there's a lot of pluses and minuses to the internet. So we have to be very careful with it. It's a serious business. So keep that all in mind. Again, we have our sources for the images in this PowerPoint. So we should always do that. And that is the presentation of Before the Internet, a little history lesson for you to help you understand which sources existed before the internet and are generally reliable. And we are done.